Welcome to Written Poetry in Africa. And on today's class, we're looking at apartheid poetry. Our main focus will be understanding what apartheid poetry is all about and how we can leverage on that in our understanding of African poetry. So, what are our learning objectives? Our objectives are quite simple. It is to explain apartheid and its effect on Black South Africa, to discuss poetry as a tool of resistance, analyze the themes in selected African poets, examine the types of Dennis Butos and Mongain Wali Sarote, then relate apartheid poetry to African literary activism. This is a prelude to this is a part one of teaching itself. And so this particular teaching will just focus on understanding what apartheid is and discussing poetry as a tool of resistance. Then we'll analyze one of Dennis Buto's poems as we go on in this class. So what is apartheid? From our description here, we say that apartheid was the racial segregation experienced in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. And there are certain key features that you have to take when we talk about apartheid in Africa. We have the separation of races, it's shown whereby we have the white staying in a place and then we have the blacks, African blacks staying in that part of the country. And then there was restricted movement for black people. So these are major core features of apartheid at that time. Then we also have issues of limited education for blacks, the land dispossession, political oppression, and brutality. Some of these key features are experienced by blacks in South Africa at that time, and the perpetrators of most of these activities were whites who were invaders of that land at that time. And we look at, in terms of historical context, you'll find out that the National Party government at that time made the laws, passed the laws, and enforced removals. In short, there was a massive imprisonment of activists like Nelson Mandela, Dennis Butos, um, and other popular faces at that time who were against the action of apartheid. So, with this background, let's now consider what poetry of resistance is in its actual sense. What is poetry as resistance? Poetry as resistance simply means a group of people coming together and writing poems to protest the injustice that they are facing. And you agree with me that at that time, a lot of South Africans, native South Africans, black South Africans were not happy with what was going on in their country and needed to fight back for their independence or for their freedom. And so you have issues of protest poetry that inspired the oppressed people to want to fight back their oppressor and gain back their freedom. And so with poetry, they were able to preserve the truth, guide the people, and challenge oppressive government by giving the people hope, which is one of the major things that people who are oppressed can leverage on at any point in time. Also, we want to consider that poetry of resistance, in terms of characteristics, are highly emotional poems. The emotional intensity of such poems are really, really high. The political language there is very obvious. Then there is realistic imagery so that the reader can experience firsthand what the poet is trying to pass across to the audience. And then in the voice, the tone of the poem or the mood of the poem, as a reader, you might experience a bout of anger and protest and a zeal, a zest for liberation. Having considered what poetry as resistance is, let's quickly look at some of the key features of poetry of resistance. Let us go back and examine them one more time. We have here that poetry of resistance consider how to express injustice. So we have protest poets often highlight social, political, or environmental injustice that affect marginalized or oppressed groups. They give a voice to those who are silenced or overlooked. Now, poetry of resistance also creates awareness. It helps raise awareness. And what type of awareness does it raise? Through vivid language, powerful imagery, and emotional appeal, protest poetry can inform readers about complex or pressing issues in a relatable and accessible way, encouraging readers to empathize with those affected. Then another thing that poetry of resistance does is it inspires action. How can pressure resistance inspire action? It inspires action whether through peaceful protest, advocacy, or activism. Poets use their words to call for justice, equality, and transformation. The emotional power of poetry can unite people, challenge societal norms, and inspire movement for reform and progress. Let's consider the context in which protest poetry or apartheid was informed. Protest poems are deeply influenced by historical, social, and cultural context in which they are written. And for a specific purpose, we're considering protest poems written from the shores or from the space of South Africa. So we look at poets often expressed respond to the injustice and struggles of their specific era, using their work to challenge dominant power structures, highlight the concerns of marginalized groups, and inspire action. We'll now move on to our poet for the day, who is Dennis Butos. About Dennis Butos, that he was an anti-apartheid activist, political prisoner, exiled from South Africa, and known for praising and protest poetry. His major concern when he writes poems is that his poems reflect freedom, human suffering, exile, and resistance. Let's now consider Dennis Buto's A Simple Lost. Dennis Buto's A Simple Lost was written in 1973 and is a collection of selected poems, which entails work from previous volumes and later when it was exiled, and a focus on themes like we said earlier on, anti apartheid, imprisonment, and exile. Some of the notable poems in A Simple Loss, which is a collection of poems, is Letters to Martha, Thoughts Abroad, Sirens, and Poems from Algiers. So you'll find out that A Simple Loss is not just a poem, it is a collection of poems that discuss predominantly issues that focus on anti apartheid, imprisonment, and exile. Let's now discuss the context of that poem itself. In terms of discussion, let us look at what issues in today's world might inspire a protest poem. Look at your environment today and list out a couple of issues that you think that can lead to you wanting to write a protest poem or protest or form an alliance with people to discuss something that they are not comfortable or pleased about. Let's now look at the working of the poem. The poem itself, the collection of poem in, um, reflects the emotional suffering, political oppression, human longing for freedom. And the tone of the whole collection was bitter, reflective, painful, and defiant. Some of the major themes in this poem are the theme of oppression, isolation, longing, and injustice. Let me remind you that A Simple Lost is a collection of poems, like I said earlier on, and it includes poems like Sirens Knuckles, Boats, written in 1963, Letters to Martha, another poem from South African prison, poems from Algiers, which was written in 1970, and Thoughts Abroad, which was also written in 1970. So it's a collection of poetry, not just a poem. But our focus for this particular teaching, which we'll look at in our part two, we'll look at the poem Letters to Martha. But the theme of most of the poems in this particular collection focus on oppression, isolation, longing, and injustice. Let's now ask ourselves a question. What issue is the poet protesting? Like we mentioned earlier on, then what is their message about this issue? You might have to read the poem to get this particular answer. What emotions did the poem evoke in you as a reader? When you read Letters to Matter, take a minute to think about it. What do I feel? How does this poem make me feel? Am I angry? Do I empathize with the people? Who do you think the poet is speaking to and why? Because we know it is Dennis Brutus, you might want to look at it that Dennis Brutus is the speaker and why who are those he is speaking to? How does the poem reflect the time or culture in which it was written? Remember, a poem is written in a particular era, a particular time, to focus on certain predominant issues that the poet is passionate about. And so you find out that the poem is a reflection of the time or era or the culture of the people that it was written about. Let's now look at an example. This example says that select a second sample poem to read and analyze, copy the poem into the slide, or provide students. Here, this instruction is let's consider some of the poetic devices used or that is reflected in the collection of poems A Simple Lost. As in most protest poetry, poets carefully choose poetic devices and language features to create impactful and persuasive messages. By manipulating the structures of the poem and using expressive language, poets can influence the reader's emotion and thinking. Now let's consider some of the sound devices that we can find across the collection of poem. We have alliteration, we have assonance, we have onomatopoeia, and we have rhyme. Some of these key devices are spread across the poem. And so when you read the poem, the collection of poetry, collection of poem, you find that it is laden with most of these sound devices. But for the purpose of this teaching, which is letters to matter, you might want to consider reading that and identifying these sound devices in the poem. We now look at figures of speech. We have metaphor, we have imagery, personification, oxymoron, and symbolism. Here, you might want to consider how to figure out, you might read the poem and look at how imagery is expressed in the poem. Then move on to oxymoron, which is why I asked that. Look at the poem and look at the element of oxymoron, the figures of speech of oxymoron used by the poet Dennis Brutus in this poem. Now, we want to ask to do a brainstorm. Can you think of any other poetic devices or language features that might be used in a simple lost, knowing that our focus is on letters to matter? What about the themes? Can you see another thing that was used in the poem from this list? When you read the poem, I'm sure you'll find this out. Let's now consider the task that we might have to do. Let's put it into practice. Choose one of the sample poems we looked at earlier on, and I said that we should consider letters to matter. Read through it a second time. Highlight and identify language features and poetic devices, considering how they contribute to the poem's themes and purpose. As you reflect on protest poetry, think about how writing and art can contribute to social change, whether through poetry, visual art, music, or storytelling. Creative expression has always been a catalyst for raising awareness and pushing for justice. Your voice, like those of protest poets, has the power to inspire others, challenge injustice, and help build a more equitable world. So, consider how you might use your own creativity to make a difference, whether on a small or large scale. Finally, look at this as your takeaway homework. Your homework task is to find an example of modern or contemporary protest poetry and look at it side by side with letters to matter found in A Simple Lost. On this note, I say thank you for listening. I'll see you in my next video where we'll consider the second poet we have for South African poetry in terms of apartheid poetry. Bye.